Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Wonderful to have you in this room. Thank you for coming. Welcome to this lecture of Studium Generale Maastricht. My name is Jaap Jansen and I am program maker at Studium Generale. And Studium Generale is, of course, a department of the university that organizes lectures, debates, lecture series, film and talk evenings, cultural events on all kinds of topics. And some time ago, I was reading this book in a Dutch translation, De Uitvinding van de Natuur. It was written by Andrea Wolff. In English translation, it's The Invention of Nature. And I was so impressed by the figure of Alexander von Humboldt, who this book is about, that I thought, well, more people should get to know him, this historical figure. And in his time, he was the most famous scientist, and he was a kind of visionary person. And his discovery changed the way we look at nature and the way we study nature and understand nature. And well, I thought we have to learn something about this person, our audience, and I was thinking, who could give a lecture about Alexander von Humboldt? Because nowadays he's more or less forgotten, or at least he's not so famous anymore. And luckily I struck upon our guest lecturer of tonight, and that's Norbert Peeters, and I thank you very much for coming to Maastricht. And he knows a lot, at least, quite something about Alexander von Humboldt. He made some podcasts about him. And he's a botanical philosopher. And maybe he will elaborate a little bit on that. I don't know. He studied archaeology and philosophy. And he is doing his PhD at Leiden University, and he is investigating the philosophical and historical background of weeds. And he is a writer. He has written a lot of books, and one of his books is called Botanische Revolutie, Botanical Revolution. It was your first book, I believe, isn't it? Yeah. And finally, he is program maker for Studium Generale at Leiden University. But only for this week. After Friday he is going to Wageningen University. But that makes him more or less a colleague of mine. So I'm very happy to introduce him to you. And please give him a warm applause. The lecture will take 1 hour approximately. And then we have half an hour for questions and answers. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome. So yes, I've been invited to speak to you about Alexander von Humboldt. He also has a famous brother, which I know nothing about. So we'll focus on Alexander von Humboldt. And the title of the lecture is Alexander von Humboldt and the Birth of Ecology. Because I want to take you on a little bit of a journey in which I want to form an argumentation of why you could call him the first ecologist. Now, I'll be speaking about more people that might be included to, or at least given this title of first ecologist. But in some sense, you could say that Alexander von Humboldt is the first ecologist. Or at least I'll give my argumentation for it. So, of course, it's a bit strange to call him the first ecologist because the word was simply not around when he was doing science, so died in 1859. And after that, not too long after that, it was Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist, great fan of Charles Darwin, who introduced this new term in biology, ecology, borrowing a little bit from the previous term that was around, the economy of nature. So if you read 18th, 19th century, especially sources on natural history, you will see this term a lot, the economy of nature. And it's a predecessor of this new term, ecology. And of course you can see it's almost built up from the same Greek words, or at least the first part is. So the first part comes from the Greek oikos, meaning house or household, in a very general sense of the word. So the cave of a cyclops could also be called an oikos, or a bird cage could also be called an oikos. So oikos was just in general a household, and even maybe a farmstead, you could say. So would denote a farmstead, a household, and of course there was a study, economics, that dealt with the dealings of how to run a good household. And especially in the beginning, but also later on, because it still carries this root, ecology, of course, sort of professes this idea of looking at nature in the sense of a household, with certain rules, certain people, certain things in place. But we'll discuss that a little bit onwards in the lecture. Ecology, in a very general sense, is a science that deals with the interaction of an organism with its environment, but in a very broad scope. So not just other organisms in the environment with which it might have interactions, but also just the environment at large. So also the geology, the geography of, the temperature, the climate of a certain place. The interaction between the organism and the place in which it lives is also part of ecology in this sense. Now, as I said already before Haeckel, there is in a certain sense ecology, only it doesn't have this name yet. But a very concise description of it is given by Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species, in which he says, plants and animals most remote in the scale of nature are bound together by a web of complex relations. This is an interesting idea because we know Charles Darwin from evolutionary thinking. And that is also a way of showing how things are, not necessarily interacting, but how they're related to one another. So if you take an evolutionary approach to nature, you're focusing on family relations, different species being related to one another. The ecological perspective is a completely different perspective, because here we see that species from very different orders are interacting with one another. That could be insects with plants, for instance, right? So these are not closely related, but in a survival sense, they are closely related because they're interacting so closely. So just to give you an example, this is one of the first ecological experiments, but again, it wasn't called an ecological experiment, but we can now say, with the benefit of hindsight, that it was. So conducted by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was interested in looking at these interactions between different organisms. And around where he lived, which was down in Kent, he wanted to focus on what is the influence of house cats on field mice populations. And he was interested in this because he wanted to know, or at least he knew, that field mice attack the nests of bumblebees, which were then known as humblebees, which is a far greater name, I think. So he wanted to see, so bumblebees had their nests, and these were attacked by field mice, but of course these field mice were attacked by cats, and he was interested to see, like, if there was more cats, would that influence the population of bumblebees? And of course he found out very quickly that it did. And by increasing the population of bumblebees, these bumblebees increased the population of red clovers. So red clovers, we know this also from Dutch meadows, is a very common plant, but it's a plant that has to be pollinated by quite a strong pollinator. And a bumblebee is capable of reaching the nectar, reaching the pollen. So in that sense, if it's going well with the red clover, that might also mean that it's going well with the bumblebees, might mean that it is not going so well with the field mice, might mean it's going very well with the cats, right? So it can have different, so these different interactions can cause different problems, or can cause different populations to rise or fall. A friend of his, Thomas Huxley, even extended this small experiment, or at least not really extended it, but he claimed that old spinsters were very important for the British Navy by ecological reasoning. So again, here we have old spinsters who have a lot of cats. Well, you can sort of figure it out, right? Which destroy a lot of field mice. That causes the bumblebee population to rise. More red clovers are being pollinated. Red clover is one of the favorite snacks of the cows that are kept by the British Navy for the meat and the dairy for the Navy. So it's going well with the cows, and then it's going well with the Navy. So in that sense, old spinsters are very important for the success of the British Navy. At least this is what Thomas Huxley claimed. Nowadays, of course, our view of by the way, just an example, the British Navy, but nowadays, of course, our view on house cats and their influence on wild creatures is a very important study and is highlighting how important or how much of an impact they can have in a surrounding. But just to give you a short example, the first ecological experiment that was undertaken, and now I want to go a little bit deeper into history to sort of make a couple of claims for people that can maybe have this title of first ecologist. Of course, it's not that important, but it is important in highlighting that people are starting to look at nature in a very different way, which is highlighting very new things, very new discoveries. So my first candidate is a very weird candidate to have because he was sort of a weird natural scientist. So Giambattista della Porta was a famous Italian scientist who wrote a book called Natural Magic, which is a bit of a weird title for a scientist to write a book about magic. But he was a bit into everything. Alchemy, he dabbled a little bit in this, dabbled a little bit in that, wrote many books, many treatises, oftentimes with ideas that are no longer valid in science. But he was not very necessarily known, but he wrote a book which is very interesting. It's called Phytognomonica, which means the judgment of plants, especially their forms. How do plants get their forms? He had very weird ideas about this. So for instance, here you see one of the pages in his book, and here we see the moon, and here we see different plants. This is a moon fern, and here we see the seed pods of two plants that are also shaped somewhat like the crescent of a moon. His idea was these plants get their form from the moon, and other plants get their forms from other planets or from the sun. So very prickly thistles or cactuses got their form from Mars, the god of war, right? And very beautiful flowers got their form from Venus, the planet Venus. So there was this idea of an astrobotany almost, an influence of the heavens on the forms of Earth, with very strange ideas. Again, I'm not saying these are true, but I'm saying this is just the ideas that he had. But he did offer one idea which is very interesting and very unusual for its time. So he's grouping together these plants and saying they get their form from this, they get their form from that. Some even have liking forms to humans. So pine cones he likens to the teeth of humans. They're similar in form somewhat. But he also has this idea that some plants belong to certain environments. It seems almost as if they're shaped to fit their environment. So he starts to group different plants that he finds up in the mountains, the alpine plants. And he starts to group different plants that he finds near water. And his claim is that the form of these plants somehow indicate where they are from. They indicate something of the meaning of the place in which they inhabit. So if you get a cactus, you're pretty sure it's not growing in a boreal, very cold climate. It's probably also not growing in a very temperate climate. It's probably more often growing in a desert, a torrid zone, a tropical region, right? And the same thing you can do with a banana. You would not expect a banana in the north of Sweden, right? Or at least not not outside of a greenhouse. So in a certain sense, the forms of plants highlight a little bit where these plants are from. And he was the first one to group plants in this manner. Not saying that's necessarily full-fledged ecology, but it is trying to think of how do plants fit in a certain environment. Maybe a better candidate is Maria Sibylla Merian. maybe also an unusual candidate, because she is most well known for her botanical illustrations or in her insect illustrations. So he was an artist by training, and in her time we get this surge of flower paintings, right? Of these still lifes showcasing all these beautiful flowers, tulips, anemones, narcissus, daffodils. All these different plants were showcased in vases, and oftentimes in these floral paintings you get little critters, you get little creepy crawlies that are included in the painting, sometimes with a bit of a religious or a symbolic meaning, but for the most part not really meaningful, definitely not in an ecological sense. Miriam was so important because she was one of the first ones to, for instance, highlight the metamorphosis of insects, showing that all insects come from an egg and go through different stages of metamorphosis to end up a butterfly or moth. But she also highlighted something very important. She wanted to highlight the special relations that plants and insects can have with one another. So this is the title page of her first book on, mostly on caterpillars from Europe going into butterflies. And here we see, this is a mulberry, or at least a branch from a mulberry tree. You can see the mulberries here, for instance. And this is the host plant of the silk moth, which was very popular in those days. This was the first caterpillar that she grew. People kept these as pets, these silk moths. She was living in Frankfurt am Main at the time, and they had this blooming silk industry. There's a whole history there of people trying to get the silk moth out of China and the Chinese trying to stop that, but by her time it's common in Europe. People keep it as a pet, and it's the first thing she studies. But she knows that if you want to have silk moths, you need to have a mulberry tree. They simply don't eat anything else. So this interaction between the plant and the insect is of such importance that they sort of belong together. So not only, because people oftentimes when they name her and they talk about her scientific credits, people oftentimes highlight that metamorphosis aspect, but I think her ecological aspect is just as important. That she was, in fact, one of the first ones to argue that there are these types of special relations between plants and animals that we should be cognizant of if we want to study nature. And another, definitely somebody who could carry the title of first ecologist, although, again, we don't necessarily know him of his ecological works, is Carolus Linnaeus. So he was a Swedish naturalist, most famous for his taxonomy. So he was very famous for making this classification of nature and the different kingdoms in nature, and also introducing this idea of giving species a double name, like Homo sapiens with humans. But he was also, at least in his time, very well known for writing on ecology, even though, like I said, it wasn't called ecology yet. But he's one of the first ones to have a dissertation written on this subject called Oeconomia Naturae. But he also wrote different dissertations that also go into different aspects of plant ecology, you could say. So he writes on the different places that plants have, so the relationship between the environment and the plant, and how you can sort of divide the environment into different stations. We would say maybe habitat types nowadays, but different stations which were inhabited by different sorts of plants. But he also writes about the dispersion of seeds, so how plants sort of travel through, by water, by wind, by humans, by other animals. They disperse their seeds to grow in new places. And he wrote this treatise called Politeia Naturae, sort of envisioning nature as this big political entity with all these different, like we have different ministries, like we have different, like a whole hierarchy of a state. He's sort of envisioning nature as a state as well, and organized as a political state. So in that sense, you could definitely say that he is writing a lot about ecology. And he's also including some of the work of the previous people that I've named, that I've highlighted. So in a certain sense, you could definitely call him one of the first ecologists. His Oeconomia Naturae, so his study of the economics of nature, starts with the line, "We understand the all-wise disposition of the Creator in relation to natural things, by which they are fitted to produce general ends and reciprocal uses." It's a bit of a, well, I mean, not necessarily easy to understand, but his idea is that the economy of nature is the way in which the Creator has given everything its station, its place in life, to serve a certain function in life, and to interact with different organisms in this sort of grand scheme of things, a very complicated household with very complicated relationships, which he saw as a clear sign of the existence of God, the fact that we had these complex relationships, right? For instance, between the silk moth and the mulberry tree. That's quite complicated to, as an insect, only specialize in one type of plant for your food, right? It's very specific. So in this, Linnaeus sort of sees this proof of the Creator creating existence, giving everything its place and function in life. But of course, tonight we're going to talk about Alexander von Humboldt, so I want to also give you an argument for why I think he is the first ecologist. So Friedrich Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt, of course more famously known as Alexander von Humboldt, here sitting in his dandy wear on his trip to South America, very relaxed, very much a gentleman scientist, as you can see. And in his time already, it was already said in the introduction, he was a very, very famous naturalist, very, very famous scientist. And also after his death, he was a celebrated figure in science, right? Right up there with Newton, right up there with Benjamin Franklin, all these other heroes of science. So this is 10 years after his death, on the centennial of his birth. He grew to be 90. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson, a transcendentalist philosopher from America, who writes, "Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, like the Admirable Crichton." I had to look that up, but the Admiral Crichton is a Renaissance figure that was sort of a Renaissance man in the Renaissance, doing a lot of arts, doing a lot of crafts, doing a lot of science, fencing, writing, etc., who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind, the force and the range of the faculties, a universal man. So his claim is that, Alexander von Humboldt is a true genius, basically. He even says, like, in one shoe, he has the entire Académie de France, right? The entire French Academy of Science, he carries around in one shoe. It's like an army moving through a country. That's how much of a enthusiastic scientist he is, trying to experiment everything, trying to collect everything, trying to talk to everybody. A very admirable figure, but not necessarily an ecologist, but an admirable scientist. And the same is true of Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin had as a boy, as a hero, he had Alexander von Humboldt. He corresponded with him later in life, and sadly when he published On the Origin of Species was the exact same year that Alexander von Humboldt passed away. But he was very much a fan of Alexander von Humboldt, especially because much of his travel with the Voyage of the Beagle went sort of along similar routes as Alexander von Humboldt had traveled. Although he was very sad, so when they embarked upon this long journey with the Beagle, the first stop was going to be Tenerife, which it almost always is, right? You stop at the Canary Islands, and then you maybe go to the Azores, and then you cross the Atlantic to Brazil. But they couldn't embark at Tenerife because there was a quarantine situation, so no ships were allowed to disembark at the harbor of Tenerife, so they had to sail on, much to the, he got very sad over that because he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his great hero. But he's reading Alexander von Humboldt while he is traveling with the Beagle. So he writes to his professor in botany, "I formerly admired Humboldt, now I almost adore him," just to show you how much of an important figure he was in the life of Charles Darwin. But that doesn't necessarily make him a first ecologist, but I do think there's a good argument to be had for this. So I want to sort of show you that he, in his thinking, is a child of two ages, you could say, or at least two modes of thinking that were very common in the 19th century. So of course he's a child of the Enlightenment. So he's a skeptical fella who loves to measure things and thinks that, observable facts are very, very important for building knowledge. And you should not all too quickly go to wonders or things you can't see or can't prove and state these as facts. So in that sense, he's a natural scientist if there ever was one. But he's also very much a romantic, which is something that at his time was not necessarily around all that long. We had Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, but there were not necessarily a lot of, well, there were quite a lot of examples for him, but it was a young movement, you could say. But I think both of these were very important for sort of shaping this way of thinking. So like I said, Linnaeus introduced this, or not coined this term, but at least he wrote a lot about what was called the economy of nature. And so this is a painting of Jan Steen. It's very famous. I mean, for Dutch people know this, right? If you say huishouden van Jan Steen, this is a sort of Dutch saying like, this is a crazy household, right? And these are depicted in his paintings. So we see the merry family, and they're very merry indeed, right? It's a drunken uncle. There's tons of music. The children are secretly drinking, and here they're smoking a pipe. So it's a disorderly household, very much with the purpose of poking fun at Dutch tidiness, right, and Dutch sort of loving of order, right? So these completely out of hand, out of order households. But of course, this was not nature. Nature was not a disorderly household, because nature had as its steward, as its superintendent, God. And how could God be a sloppy housekeeper? So people thought that in nature, actually, things were very much in balance, very much harmonious, very much everything in its right place. A very common way to still speak about nature when we speak about nature, especially wild nature. People oftentimes use words like harmonious, balance when they talk about. But this stems from this idea that we find, and this is called natural theology in the days of Alexander von Humboldt as well, which was a weird branch of science. It was sort of religious science almost. It was saying that if you look at the physiology of organisms, or you look at the place that they have in the world, you cannot but wonder, or at least you cannot help but think that these were put there, or these were created there by a supreme creator. At least this was the idea that was very common. So just to give you one quote by William Durham, who wrote a book called Physicotheologia. So he writes, if all the animals and plants of our globe had been made by chance, or placed by chance, or without divine providence, their organs would have been otherwise than they are, and their place and residence confused and jumbled. A bit of a strange argument, but it's sort of like the argument for what's called the argument for design. Like, look at the eyeball, or look at other organs. Look how perfectly they are organized. Of course, later on we learn they are not so perfectly organized after all, but this was the argumentation, right? It's so complex, how could this be the product of chance? Of blind chance. So not just the organs and the complex way in which they're organized, but also the way in which the globe sort of is organized, and the way in which plants and animals have been distributed over the globe was not a product of chance, they thought. This was a product of divine wisdom. And you had this very strong current still, so this is another text by Linnaeus about the extension of the livable earth. There was a very popular geology idea, also supported by Newton, that the habitable earth was growing steadily and seas were sort of diminishing. So if you would go back in time, you would come to a little island in a vast ocean, and if you go forward in time, you get a far larger and larger and larger landmass until you reach the current landmass, sort of. So the idea was that the landmass was expanding, and with that also the creatures were dispersing. So from a sort of paradisical island, sort of an earthly paradise, very Christian idea, of course, from this paradise, all creatures dispersed over the globe. So this also was a very common idea, sort of trying to understand why things are in a certain place by going to this transcendental entity to give you a strong footing. So right before von Humboldt, we see this critiqued very heavily by a couple of fingers, but one in particular, which is Immanuel Kant, Prussian philosopher who wrote a very boring book called The Kritik der Urteilskraft. But in this book, he also attacks Linnaeus, and he attacks this physical theology, right? This natural theology. So he writes, and this is very revolutionary for his time. Land and sea not only contain monuments of ancient and mighty devastations by which they and all the creatures upon and in them were affected. So not only do we see, when we look at the geology, that we see a lot of devastation, a lot of destruction, and a lot of destruction of species. But you also see, let me read on. The strata of the land and the coastlines of the sea seem solely the result of the savage, omnipotent forces of nature working in a chaotic state. So there were voices being heard for the first time, people saying, it doesn't look that orderly at all. Why would we say it's orderly? If you look at the different strata of geology, we see all these remnants of huge devastations, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and all these different disasters. Things don't seem that orderly at all, right? People were sort of critiquing this idea that somehow we could say this is orderly because there was divine providence. And there's another thing happening. So in Enlightenment, we see a growing critique on going to God to explain where things are on the globe. And on the other hand, we see the rise of the Romantic era, and with that rise, a revolution in how we look at the natural world and how we look at especially wilderness. So this is a quote by C.S. Lewis, famous for the Chronicles of Narnia, but also famous for doing a little bit of philosophy. And he has this great quote that sort of encapsulates this idea of this change in how we view nature. So he writes, "The change from an age when man frankly hated and feared all things in nature which are neither sensuously pleasing, useful, safe, symmetrical, or gaily colored, to an age when men love and actually seek out mountains, waste places, dark forests, cataracts, and storm-beaten coasts." Bit of a mouthful, let me take a sip of water. So this is, to me, very strange, right? Because it highlights that if you talk to somebody from the 18th century and you're telling him, I'm going mountaineering this summer, he would think you were crazy, right? Or if you would go to a beach holiday, right? The people would think you're crazy. There were no beach holidays. People didn't go to the beach for fun, or go mountain climbing for fun, or go skiing. Or when Rousseau asked his friends, can we walk over the Alps? His friends were like, you're mad. Why would you do that? When people took their carriages across the Alps, they would close the curtains to not be so frightened by the ravines, the cliffs, the sheer size of these mountains. So wilderness was something that struck awe and terror in your soul. Same is true for waterfalls. We quite like waterfalls, right? But when people, for instance, first started visiting Niagara Falls, people were horrified at what they saw. So it's quite strange to think that in the span of, not too much time, so basically 18th to 19th century, people all of a sudden start to really appreciate the wilderness. And like he said, people actually seek it out, Right now it's very common, right? You can go on a wilderness trip, you can go to the jungle, you can go to waterfalls, you can do all sorts of nature, wilderness experience things, right? So, but this was very strange to an 18th century person. So I had a friend of mine who loves mountaineering, and he went to India to climb one of the big mountains in the Himalaya. And the farmer came up to him like, "Why are you going to climb that mountain? Which god did you anger that you have to be punished this severely?" Right? It's not natural at all to be wanting to climb up mountains, to look at the view, for instance. Very uncommon. So, just to show you a little bit how this works in basically in real time, not in real time, but how this works. So this is Mont Blanc, or at least an image of Mont Blanc from the ascent by de Saussure, the first one to scale the Mont Blanc and reach the top. But by then it was called Mont Maudit, meaning terrible mountain. And if you look at old names for mountains, it's all of this type of language. Terrible, horrible, devil's arse is but all these negative words, right? Mountains were not places that you wanted to go to. Mont Blanc is a very romantic, this is a name that came up after the Romantic age, right? This is sort of more serene, pristine type of name. So people were starting to mountaineer, scale these mountains, no longer, of course, still fearful, but no longer with that very basic fear to stop them doing that. So this is Horace Benedict de Saussure, like I said, the first one to reach the top, and he took the top with him in a very Enlightenment sort of way. So this is in the Tylers Museum, the top of Mont Blanc. Did anybody know that? Ever see the top of Mont Blanc in the museum? Of course, if you cut off the top, you could claim that's no longer the top of the Mont Blanc, that's just a big stone. But it is a very strange act to do that. Very Enlightenment, right? Sort of wanting to control nature that much that you take the tip of the largest mountain in Europe. I'll skip over this, we get the point. So mountains were all of a sudden being very highly esteemed. And this shows in Alexander von Humboldt's work. So we see him on this very skeptical path, this very Enlightenment path, trying to do a lot of measurements, observations, not wanting to call for a god to help him trying to figure this out. And on the other hand, we see a very romantic figure who loves to write and is complaining that scientists write such boring books and that people should go to these wilderness places and study nature there, right? And this is, of course, also what he is going to do. So here we have him again. And in the book by Andrea Wolff, we get quite a long list, and this is just a list you can make, of the different fields he was interested in, right? And there were many. He was quite a polymath, but I think it sort of disrupts also what is his aim of his journey. So he went on a journey for around about 5 years to South America, together with a French botanist called Aimé de Bonpland. And why they took this journey, you really have to sort of look at this journey and study it in detail to find out why they went on this journey. But he doesn't make it very easy for us to know what his goal is, because he is interested in everything. So like I said, he's a very famous mountaineer. He scaled many mountains and held the record for highest mountain climb for, I think, 30, 40 years or something. Not that people were in stiff competition then, but nonetheless. He's a mineralogist and a geologist. He works for the Ministry of I'm not sure, it's probably not mines, but the Prussian ministry who deals with mining. And he makes all these innovations in a very short time of improving the work, or improving the workplace for the miners, and improving the way they saw below ground, and improving the air conditions. But also very interested in mineralogy, very interested in crystals. His dissertation is on the different minerals of the Rhine. He's a very famous botanist. So on the journey to South America alone, he takes with him, it's about 4,000 to 5,000 new species for science, which is a lot. And he's even stating in his travel journey, over in his travel logs, like, I'm not really interested in looking for new species. But he takes home around about 5,000 of them. So he is finding quite a lot of them. He's an animal physiologist, very interested in the way in which electricity operates the human body, right? Very short before, or not a short time before him, people were starting to, so Galvani and other people were starting to realize that electrical impulses, are very important for most of our movements. So he was looking into this as well. Meteorologist, he's one of the first ones to start to collect data on a very great scale, so collecting the different temperatures of all the different cities in the world, for instance, trying to bring this data together, trying to see if we can visualize this data in a very clear way. So very important in that sense. Oceanologist, there's a Humboldt current named after him right off the coast of South America. So many things. Anthropology, archaeology, agriculturalist even. He discovers the importance of guano, which was already mined at the time, but it's sort of like bird poo. Bird poo that collects over a long period of time from seabirds that come in on the coast. And this poo is sometimes like meters in, like this is just huge strata of bird poo, which are being dug out and used as fertilizer back then. So it was before artificial fertilizers. Guano was very important for agriculture. So many things. But, ecologist, or maybe even a better word in his case is, because he deals with a specific type of ecology, it's plant geographer. This is what his journey is really about. This whole 5-year journey, all these different expeditions he goes on. I think the central purpose of this journey, even though that's not highlighted often enough, is plant geography. Sounds very boring, but I'll explain why this is so important for him. So first, it's good to note that the first place Humboldt traveled to, before going to South America, was the Netherlands. Like I said, he did a dissertation on the minerals, or the basalts of the Rhine River, the lower Rhine. But he also went on a journey together with George Forster, very famous explorer. He was on the second voyage of James Cook. And he takes Humboldt along with him on this long journey through basically the Rhine Delta, but also parts of the Meuse, and also parts of, they also go to France, they also go to the UK. But this Dutch part is very interesting. And what's also interesting is that, so this is the frontispiece of this book. First, it's interesting to note that it's called Ansichten, which is a term that's going to be very important for Humboldt. And we get this strange character. This is sort of like a Artemis or Isis figurine, which being sort of like a religious statue, being, celebrated, sort of like symbolizing Mother Nature. This is also going to be very important for Humboldt. So they go through the Netherlands, they go to Brabant, and they go to Rotterdam, Delft, The Hague, and they especially spend a lot of time in Amsterdam. So this begins with a very strange scene, almost like a deus ex machina. All of a sudden they appear at the Admiral's Wharf in Amsterdam, which is right on the IJ water, right? And there they see this vast ocean, but this sort of vast sea of masts, right, of ships. Because it's huge, the Admiral's Wharf, but also just the fleet of the Dutch is impressive by this time. And they go into Amsterdam and they start to study this city in the way that people that traveled in the 18th century did. Meaning also that they go to the Dam Square to look at the faces of the people for an entire day. I'm not sure what they do. I mean, maybe they take a share or something, but they sit on the Dam Square entire day to study the faces of the Amsterdammers, of the citizens of Amsterdam. And they find out after a day of studying that they're not as ugly as the Brabanders. That's very important. And but they don't really find an elegant figure between the Amsterdammers. So they're a bit sad about that, but this is very common for people traveling to places, right? This is a study which is called physiognomy, coming from these two Greek words, meaning nature and judgment, interpret. And it's sort of like interpreting faces. And by interpreting these faces, trying to guess what kind of character people have. So certain types of faces sort of divulge certain secrets about what type of person you are, right? So it's not a famous book, but this was a strange field of science, right? It's no longer practiced seriously today. But, so this is a great example of it, right? So this is, the genuine husband has a hairline that's a little bit different from and also just different facial features from the unreliable husband. But it was a very serious form of study, right? Studying these faces was part of studying flora, fauna, architecture, art, and also studying the humans, right? Studying the people that you visited. But this will play a very important part later on in his journeys. Because the most important journey we should focus on is, of course, the journey he took to South America, which he's most well known for. By the way, we also see here Aimé de Bonpland. Just again, I'm not focusing on him quite that much, but he's, of course, very important for this whole trip. Now, like I said, the first stop that Darwin also wanted to make was Tenerife. And especially to see this tree, or at least this was on his bucket list. He wanted to see this tree. When Humboldt was younger, he went to the botanical gardens in Berlin and saw his first impressions of tropical vegetation and of all these weird different plants. And this was also a plant that he saw in the botanical garden, but just a small specimen of it. Here in Tenerife, he sees whole forests of these dragon trees, which is a strange name, dragon tree, but it's sort of like a famous species because it has all these famous stories and legends attached to it. So the most expensive violins, the Stradivarius violins, are, I'm not sure, not coated, but how do you say? I'm skipping now, I don't know the word, but vernis, which is varnish? Varnish, yeah. The varnish for the Stradivarius violin comes from the resin of this tree, which is sort of like a red-like sap. So if you cut it, it oozes this red-like sap, almost as if it's bleeding. And that's also why people think it's called the dragon tree. There's, of course, well, not of course, but there is this story, this myth of Hercules going to the garden of the Hesperides and having to fight the dragon Ladon. And some people claim that Hercules went to Tenerife and cut down one of the biggest dragon trees that were around. And that this was actually the land of the Hesperides, where he would find the golden apples. Of course, it's a apocryphal story, but nonetheless. So he sees these trees, but the most important thing he does, or at least he wants to do immediately, is climb the volcano. Everywhere Humboldt goes and there's a hill or a mountain inside, he is climbing it. And this is also true for Tenerife, which has a very famous volcano, El Teide. And here we can see this plant geography coming to life. Like, why is he so interested in this? So here we see the volcano, and immediately you can recognize, of course in a very simplified manner, he's giving different vegetation zones. So starting at the bottom of the volcano, we find palm trees and bananas, for the most part. Then we get the cereals, so these are the cultivated agricultural fields that hold all the grains and bread wheat and whatnot. Then above that you get the laurel forest, which is not something cultivated by man, but it's wild. Above the laurel forest you get pine trees, a specific type of pine tree, the Canarian pine. And above that you get lower vegetation, and you get lichens. And then he finds, very close to the top, so right about here, he finds this little violet as the last flowering plant on the volcano. But you can see here that, well, these different vegetation layers are interesting, right? Especially, well, there's one layer that's especially interesting. So this laurel layer, so that's deciduous trees, basically. So, like oaks, like beeches. And these laurel trees form a very important strip of vegetation on this island, also on Madeira. But people say that these are actually the remnants of a once great laurel forest that spanned all the way across the Mediterranean into Turkey, into Asia Minor. But this is the only bit that remains. Probably disappeared because of ice ages, because of human being cutting down trees, etc. but it remains on these islands as this like small pocket, reminding us of what was once in Europe as well. So he climbs, of course, he climbs the volcano, reaches to the top, and on the top of the volcano he has two very important quotes, especially one that's gotten him very famous. So first he says, "We saw the plants divided into zones, according to the temperature of the air, decreasing as the height of the spot increases. Below the piton," this is the cauldron of the volcano, "the lichens begin to cover the shiny lava slag. A violet, related to the Viola decumbens, grows on the slopes of the volcano up to, well, this many meters high." So this is interesting. Why these zones, right? Who planned this? And he writes this very short, of course this is in German, "Alles ist Wechselwirkung," right? Everything is interaction. He's sort of starting to claim that, like he says in this quote, so apparently if you move up a mountain, you get a change in vegetation, and that somehow has to do with the climate and the geology changing as we move up the mountain. In very short, of course. When he reaches the South of America, and especially when he reaches Ecuador, he starts to scale a lot more volcanoes. So just to show you a couple, these are sketches that he made of different volcanoes, but in Mexico and in Ecuador, he climbs a lot of them, and these are of course far grander and higher than the one on Tenerife. Especially Chimborazo, which was back then thought to be the highest mountain on Earth, which is a sizable mountain still. I mean, even compared to, even now that we know Everest is higher, this is still a very sizable mountain. And he decides to scale this mountain, of course, as well. But again, not just because he wanted to mountaineer or enjoy the view, but specifically because he wants to study this field of plant geography, of how different plants are distributed on the globe. And this is also the first publication that he writes right after his journey. So he starts to collect on this 5-year journey, and the first thing he writes when he returns, which still takes some time, but the first thing he writes is an essay on the geography of plants. Just to show you how important, and what's even more interesting is that connected to this essay is this quite, well, it's a weird image, especially in his day. It's sort of like the father of all infographics, right? It's sort of, it really is in an archaeological sense that, right? So in a certain sense you could say many of our infographics are related to the ones that, or the one that Humboldt made, because he was one of the first ones to try to combine a whole lot of information in a visually accessible way. Not necessarily, well, for him it maybe was pleasing. I find it to be very pleasing, but maybe it's also a little bit outdated. But it was very interesting because it wasn't really done before. So he calls it tableau physique in French. And it's a weird word, tableau. But he borrows this from the encyclopedians, like Denis Diderot, who used this word to indicate sometimes you can combine painting with writing. And this is an example of doing just that, which sounds a given, but just I'll tell you why this is so interesting and so important. So just to show you, so right here we have Chimborazo, and then right behind it is Cotopaxi. Later on, Friedrich Edwin Church of the Hudson River School in America traveled after Humboldt, making these great grand paintings of the different places that Humboldt visited. So this is Cotopaxi, and this is Chimborazo. But in realness, or in reality, these are not very close together. But he just puts them close together in this weird image. But it's a weird image in a lot of other ways. So it's weird in the sense that this is a cross-section of the entire continent of South America, which is, well, it's not true, right? But he explains that he has jumbled a little bit with the x-axis, right? So, of course, this is in no sense a good depiction of the cross-section of an entire continent, because, so this would then be the Amazon, because this is at the height of the equator. is of course not true, but he explains in the text that if he would have made an accurate x-axis, so an accurate horizontal representation, it would be very flat, with just a little p where these great mountains are. So he played with that a little bit, but the y-axis, so the horizontal or the vertical axis, is very accurate. So the height in this sense is very accurate, and this is where we get to the infographics part, because he's writing all these little things, scribbling around the mountain. So first of all, this is the highest one. This denotes how high Gay-Lussac, a French naturalist, went in his hot air balloon, which was higher than the top of Chimborazo. This happened shortly after Humboldt left for South America. And then we see all these other writings, which is basically indicating different mountains in Europe as references. He also notes how high his predecessor came on Chimborazo. This is La Condamine. He came to here, and Humboldt reaches this point, right under the top. He's very sad about that. He doesn't write about the ascent of this Chimborazo mountain for a very long time, but people really want to know what happened. So he waits like around 20 years before he writes it down. And then he explains how difficult this journey was, and that they were almost there. He could see it, the top, and he knew that it was about 3 to 4 Vaticans, like high, until he reached it. But they were crawling by this time. They were crawling and they were bleeding from their eyes and gums. And this is, of course, he's trying to scale this mountain with very little protection, very little material. And what's making it a lot worse for himself and his companions is that he wants to do a lot of measurements. Every 100 meters he wants to do measurements, and not one, but like 20. So I think it's right about here where most of his servants leave him. And just say, you're on your own. Well, not on his own, but he's together still with Carlos Montufar. Bonpland is still there, and their most trusted servant, José. So just the 4 of them crawling, and this is a moon-like landscape, right? Scattered with huge cliffs and rocks. There's no path, so it's really indeed it's very dangerous. And I think it's a good thing that he came back, or he went down again. Didn't try for the top, because he would have not survived, right? So. But of course, what's most striking about this is this strange cross-section of this mountain, which is 2/3 cross-section, and 1/3 is detailed, sort of artistically pleasing representation. And then we see this. This huge word cloud is all different species. So it's mostly different species, but also different vegetation forms, but mostly species. And this brings us to, what is the meaning of this lovely tableau physique? What do you do with it, right? Why? Why did he make this? Now, as you can see, there's lots of columns or tables right next to the mountain, which give you very detailed information. The idea was that you pick a species on the mountain, and you get a huge ruler, and you lay that horizontally so that it covers the different columns. And then within these columns, you get a lot of information. So he notes the temperature, the geology, the barometric pressure. He even brings a cyanometer, which is a circle where you can determine what color blue the sky is, which is no longer used that often, but it's a nice little thing he brought along with him as well. So he's bringing all these different things to make these measurements. He's boiling water, seeing what the boiling point of water is on all the different, after each 100 meters or so. He's also making notes on the different animals that live there. He's making notes on the different plants that are being cultivated on the slopes. And he's trying to compress all of this information into one infographic, so that you can determine, why is something growing somewhere? In what conditions is it growing? And are these conditions maybe very important for the existence of these plants? You can sort of see where this is going, right? So you would have a species, but you could instantly know what animals are living around it, on what type of geology, what's the minerals like, what is the soil like in which it grows, what is the light intensity, what is the overall temperature year-round, etc., etc., etc. You get a lot of information on the growing conditions of these different plants and the interactions with their surroundings. He even notes that there are slaves working on this mountain, on the slopes to, I think it's for sugarcane. So there's a lot of information packed into one huge tableau physique. So just to give you some of these, these are just these different tables, what he's measuring in German. So you can also see, which is also maybe, so these are also, height measurements of different parts of the world. So you can compare it to different mountains. How high is the Popocatépetl in Mexico compared to Chimborazo, for instance? And he's making a German edition, and in this edition he gives us a little bit of a answer as to why he's so interested in this subject. So he makes this title page, and as you can maybe read, he dedicates it to a very famous writer, very famous friend of his. So he dedicates it to Goethe. We also know this from this little stone that is here, which reads, sort of undecipherable, but it says Metamorphose der Pflanzen. So Metamorphosis of Plants, one of the books that, my goodness, I did something wrong. Okay. One of the books that Goethe wrote. But this image is very interesting. Like I said, on the Book of Forster, you get this statue of Artemis, this statue of sort of Mother Nature that's being honored. Here we also get a Mother Nature statue. So this is the statue of Artemis, presumably. Oftentimes how Artemis is depicted. But people usually call her Isis, or usually call this figure Isis, so the Egyptian goddess Isis, which is being unveiled here by an Apollo-like figure, right? So the lute, or how do you say? I don't know what this is called, but what he is holding is sort of denoting that we're dealing with Apollo. But what does this mean, this unveiling of Isis? And what's the relationship between Goethe and Humboldt? So this Isis figurine, or this personification of Mother Nature, was very important in 18th and 19th century imagery. So Immanuel Kant, who I introduced earlier, Prussian philosopher, once wrote about this statue, about this goddess Isis. He writes, "Perhaps nothing more sublime has ever been said or thought more sublimely expressed than in this inscription above the temple of Isis, Mother Nature. I am all that is, that was, and that shall be, and no mortal has lifted my veil." So the idea was that really true knowledge of nature could not be reached because nature was a veiled entity, and you could not look behind the veil, basically. Or at least this is what Kant is claiming, that is impossible. Now, of course, in his day, people were already claiming to really know the secrets of nature, but he's saying this is impossible. You cannot lift her veil. You cannot really get true knowledge of nature. But of course, Humboldt is claiming the exact opposite with this frontispiece. And he is giving you this little link with Goethe. Why Goethe? So I think it holds an important key as to understand why he's writing this and why he's doing all of this, why he's interested in plant geography. So Goethe writes this book, the Metamorphose der Pflanzen, so the metamorphosis of plants, in which he wants to describe that the different parts of plants can somehow be reduced to certain key organs. And that even these key organs can be reduced to one another and be discussed as different metamorphoses of a leaf. Which is a bit of a strange idea, but it's one that he gets during his Italian voyages. But first let me show this. So Goethe was corresponding with Humboldt, and Humboldt was telling him, I'm writing a German translation, and I'm going to dedicate it to you. And it's going to include this Natuurdenkgemälde, this tableau physique. And Goethe is so enthusiastic that he writes Humboldt, and he adds his own tableau, just as a sort of preemptive strike almost, so just to show you, is this what you're going to send me? So he paints this. Very strange picture, but it's just to give you a little bit of note. So here we find Humboldt, and here we find Des Saussures on the Mont Blanc. And these are the two mountain chains from the two different continents, and this is Des Saussures waving to Humboldt from the other continent. So this is just what he sends Humboldt. So this is a really nutty relationship, right? But it's I think it's a nice treat. But like I said, he went on this Italian journey, and during this Italian journey, he visits, well, many, of course, of the ancient sites, many of the architectural wonders of Italy. But he also goes to quite a lot of botanical gardens. And one of these gardens is maybe the oldest we have in Europe, which is in Padua. And here he is so taken aback by the multitude of forms of plants that he starts to think, how am I able to call all of these things plants? Is there maybe a prototype plant, like something that is laying at the foundation of all the different plant forms that we know? He calls it an Urpflanze, like an ancient plant, but not really ancient, but more like a prototype. Is there a prototype somewhere in the plant kingdom, which is the prototype for all these wonderful forms I'm seeing? So he goes in search of this prototype. He thinks that he can find it somewhere in nature. It's the prototype of all plants. So he goes to search quite a lot. He eventually ends up in Palermo, and in the gardens of Palermo, which is beautiful, right? It's Mediterranean climate, lovely fruit trees, etc., etc. He's taking that all in, and while he's writing a play called Nausicaa, which talks about Nausicaa is from the Odyssey. It's one of the princesses that Odysseus meets on his travels, but he's trying to write this play and he can't because he's being bothered by this question, like, where do all these multiple plant forms come from? Where is this prototype plant? And he ends up saying that he's looking in the wrong direction. There's no prototype of a plant to be found, but there is a sort of prototype. And he says the prototype of all plants is the leaf. The leaf is the most basic plant form. In some sense, this is actually true, or at least he's striking upon something very important later on in botany. But he writes, while walking in the public gardens of Palermo, it came to me in a flash that in the organ of the plant, which we are accustomed to call leaf, lies the true Proteus who can hide and reveal himself in vegetable forms. From the first to the last, plant is nothing but leaf, which is so inseparable from the future term that one cannot think of one without the other. So the leaf is the most essential plant organ, and all other forms seems to be related to the leaf. It's just the leaf in different configurations, different metamorphoses. And he starts to speculate on how do they get these forms. And here we reach strange territory, because here he's talking about how certain plants from a species can, when growing near the coast, where it's very windy, harsh weather, they grow spiny, they grow leathery leaves. While further inland, where it's more warm temperature or temperate, they can grow big, lush leaves. Basically saying that the environment acts as a sort of mold in which a plant takes its form. So there's a really important interaction between the environment and the plant, and somehow this environment is actually forming plants. And this is all before Darwin, so we don't have an evolutionary idea behind this yet, but it's a very interesting idea, and it's one that Humboldt finds to be very important. So what he's starting to do in South America during his travels is look at what he calls the plant physiognomy. So again, he's taking this physiognomy that he was practicing in the Dam Square, judging people, and now he wants to judge vegetation. He wants to look at the different forms of vegetation and see what they tell us about an environment. So he wants to talk about, or he wants to sort of leave the concept of species behind, and he wants to draw more towards the concept of form. Because he says form is the most important thing. It's the thing that you see when you reach a certain landscape, and it's the thing that dominates your view of a landscape. So he says that you should look at form. So this is a bit strange, right, to talk about forms, because it's not something that ecologists do anymore. So I want to highlight it with a good example. So we know this character, right? Bob Ross. Yes. Now, Bob Ross is a very good painter, but also you find that how does Bob Ross paint his paintings? Not by drawing every separate tree individually, every separate branch individually. Like if you're painting and you want to paint a pine forest or an oak forest, you use certain techniques. You give the impression of a pine forest without individually painting all the pines. And Humboldt says this is very important for the plant geographer. The plant geographer needs to look at the surroundings like he is painting. Because then you focus on what's most dominant in the landscape. Because you know a pine forest can also hold many different other species. But if you look at it from a distance, this is what dominates your view. This is what actually is most important in the landscape. And this is also where the tightest connection is made between the landscape and the vegetation that it holds. So just to give you an example, so this is again one of these church paintings, and here you see it as well. Maybe in the foreground he's adding a little bit more detail, but especially when we go more into the background, we can see that he is not painting individual species, but he's taking more of a general approach and looking at what's striking his eye, what is striking his aesthetical quality. You know what I mean? Sort of like what's striking him when you look at the environment. And then you get to these vegetative zones or vegetation zones. So again, here is Chimborazo. Now, what Humboldt noticed was that, so if you think along these lines of Goethe, that the information he's giving here is not just information he's gathering, but might actually hold the key to the mold into which these different plant species take their shape. And that somehow these plant species seem to be adapted to or interacting with this environment and thereby surviving in a certain place or not surviving in a certain place. And it's even true that if we move up the mountain, we're basically doing the same thing as if we move up from the equator to the pole, which is also very strange. In a certain sense, you could say that the bottom layer of vegetation is comparable to the layer of vegetation you would find in the tropics. And if we move up the mountain and we go to the deciduous trees that are characteristic for the temperate zone, we go to the pine trees characteristic for the boreal zone, and we move all the way up to the alpine region, the alpine plants, and then last the lichens, like the last life forms that can survive at very great heights. That these actually show you also how the vegetation moves from the equator to the pole. Like this is the same. So in a certain sense, Chimborazo is an example of the entire Earth. Right? This mountain alone is sort of illustrating how things on the entire globe would be dispersed. Like everywhere we can find plants that somehow seem to fit their environment very well. And maybe this fitting business is something more of plant interacting with the environment without divine intervention. Now, of course, there's still pieces of the puzzle missing here. So we still don't have evolution. We don't have this idea of variety. We don't have this idea of selection, of struggle for existence, of extinction. But you do hopefully see that he is getting there very slowly but surely. Right? He is already trying to think without God, how did things get their place on this earth? His last book he entitles Cosmos, and I think this is a very good title because it also encapsulates this aesthetic way of looking at the world. Right? He's basically saying a plant geographer should look like a painter at the world. And cosmos also comes from we get the word cosmetics from that, so it also indicates beauty, aesthetics, and on the other hand, it's him trying to think of how different things are, where they are, without trying to use this divine intervention. We're trying to think of only of measurements, only of nature, when we deal with these types of subjects. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Good? Yeah, I sort of had this little encore to tie it to the Netherlands, but... Yeah. So I can add a little bit, because I was wondering how long I was going to talk, because there's quite a lot of information to give you. But I also wanted to tie it to the Netherlands. So maybe I finish on Holland's Humboldt, right? So to show you that his ideas were also influential here in the Netherlands, and that there's a nice parallel between the Netherlands and Humboldt. Let me just take a final sip then. So let me talk very shortly about this character, Frederik van Eede Senior. His son, Junior, is more famous in the Netherlands, famous writer, psychiatrist. But Frederik van Eede Senior was also very famous in the 19th century, especially because he was the one that coined the term natuurmonumenten, which is the first nature conservation organization here in the Netherlands. But he's also very interesting because he's heavily influenced by Humboldt. And Humboldt, because of Humboldt, he goes to the dunes, the Dutch mountains, to do what Humboldt did in South America, only on a little bit of a smaller scale. But it's very comparable. So so here you see a painting a little bit of, so he was from Haarlem, so you can see that, sorry. So you can see Sint-Bavo here of Haarlem, and here we see this path leading into the dunes. Again, he's a real romantic here because, like I said before, mountains, sea coasts, waterfalls were all despised, and this was true for the dunes as well. So you wouldn't find any other walkers here or tourists here, right? These dunes were pretty empty. But he goes to the dunes with a very important purpose. It's his first destination for a book he's writing called Onkruid, or Weeds, Botanical Walks Through the Netherlands. And this book starts with a quote by Humboldt from the book Cosmos, in which he says, "Nature in every corner of the world is a mere reflection of the whole." Again, a bit of a cryptic clue, but I'll explain by using Van Eede's example. So, Van Eede, traveling these dunes, is very enamored with the flora he meets, the plants that belong in the dunes. And he's thinking again of how these are related to their environment, right? So the sea holly, like Humboldt explained, has spiny leaves, leathery leaves, seems very well adapted to living near the coast. Goethe even goes so far as to say it's a little bit sea-colored because it lives so close to the sea, which is of course a bit silly, but I like the idea. And the sea buckthorn, and he writes about these plants as if they're sort of nobility. So he calls the sea holly the darling of the sea, and he calls the sea buckthorn king of the dune plants. Now, to understand why he's doing this, he's from Haarlem, and Haarlem was sort of like Florence in the Netherlands, famous for growing flowers. And growing flowers, breeding flowers, is called in Dutch veredelen, making noble. So by saying that we're making something noble, well, what does that mean? When we talk about wild flora, he's sort of wanting to change that around. So he despises tulips, he despises, pansies, all these other different cultivated flowers. And he loves wild flora, and he's giving these noble titles to them. But why this quote, right? In every corner you find a glimpse of the whole. What he finds in the dunes is that vegetation, to his mind, is very common to, or very similar to vegetation you would find in other places on Earth. So he says, in the dunes I find all these thistles. Don't they remind you of the cactuses or the cacti that grow in the prairies of North America? And doesn't the white water lily remind you of the Amazon water lily growing in the Amazon basin? And the reindeer lichen reminds him of the tundras, right? These sort of desolate, cold places. He also says that the reeds that surround the little dune lakes remind him of the palms and the banana forms that Humboldt describes. And he even finds in the dunes all these alpine flora, all these alpine flowers, meaning flowers that originally come from the Alps, the Pyrenees, all these high mountains. He finds them in the dunes as well. So he's basically trying to argue that in a certain sense, in the Dutch dunes, you can sort of experience the entire world flora in a certain sense. Of course, it's a very far-reaching and far-flung, not to be taken all too seriously, but just to show you how well these ideas are sort of landing in the Netherlands. And like I said, he was the first one to promote this idea of trying to protect nature. So it started with him memorizing Beekberger Woud, which is a wood he used to love to walk in, which has disappeared in his day. And he said, shouldn't we have kept this as a monument of the bygone nature of our country? This forest was just as valuable as the old building for the history of the Dutch architecture, and the safeguarding of such remarkable places from demolition hands has to be entrusted to the Royal Academy of Sciences. And for this idea, he chooses this idea, nature's monument, which is actually a term he borrows from Humboldt. Humboldt talks multiple times of natuurdenkmal, which is also a place that sort of remembers how nature used to look in the Netherlands, but these are just the last remnants, the last relics that are left. And like I said, he is sort of like the founding father of the first Dutch natural conservation or nature conservation organization, Natuurmonumenten. And that concludes my talk for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert, for this wonderful lecture and this well-structured lecture. We don't have that much time for questions anymore, I'm afraid, because we have to end at 9:30. So maybe we can do one or two questions. So please, if you have a pressing question, raise your hand and I will run to you with a microphone. Yes.
Hello. So the examples of scientists you gave were all based in Europe and America. Do you know of any scientists coming from other parts of the world who contributed to the idea of ecology or the discipline at all?
Yes, but of course, this influence is a bit more difficult to track. So I would say that he is using a lot of knowledge, or at least to build his ecological knowledge, he is using a lot of knowledge from the people that he visits there. Like I said, he's not climbing that mountain alone. He has a whole team with him, basically. So I think he is taking a lot of information from that as well. And I think the same is true for these other people. So Maria Sibylla Merian went to Suriname, but of course there also she was instructed by locals where to look for certain butterflies, right? Or what would be possible food plants. So I think, aspects of this knowledge are already, or details of the knowledge are already around and are being picked up like huge vacuum cleaners by these naturalists, right? Who transverse this country all over, and so yeah, they get a lot of knowledge from the locals. Now, before indigenous knowledge on different ecological relations becomes more prominent, we really have to move to like the 20th or maybe even the 21st century, right? Because indigenous people were oftentimes not printing books, so we have little knowledge, right? But we find usually, indirectly through sources of Europeans that a lot of knowledge was given. So I've looked myself at the Moluccan flora, and I studied a 17th century naturalist who worked there, Rumphius, who was a spice merchant dealing in cloves. And even though he's from the 17th century, he writes down quite a lot of names, quite a lot of people that give him information on certain species, on where to look for certain species. So I think all these Europeans were highly reliant on people that were very intertwined or integrated in this landscape, so they knew where to, to show them where to look. So I think that it wouldn't have been possible to do these ecological discoveries without the help. But it's very hard, of course. I mean, I can't really attach a name, especially not in this age. That's very difficult to do. I hope this sort of answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting lecture. A little bit to follow up on that question. One of the things that von Humboldt also was, and that you didn't mention, is a politician. He was very much involved in politics of the Americas. So that means both North America and South America. So I guess he must have been really very familiar with the thinking of many of the native populations, and I'm thinking especially of Mexico, but also the South American, more or less local intellectuals. That must have influenced him a lot.
Well, I mean, and Andrea Wolff describes this in large detail. I mean, he is a political figure. I'm not sure if I would label him a politician in that sense, but he has a lot of political ideas.
And you already warned for climate change.
He warns for
deforestation.
He warns for at least deforestation and the negative effects on climate. But the political side, I mean, of course, he has to ask permission for this journey to the King of Spain to travel his new colony. So he can't make too much noise. But he's making quite a lot of noise still, right? He also goes to the Americas. He talks to Thomas Jefferson, even though Thomas Jefferson was still a slave owner at that time. We know that Alexander von Humboldt was very much opposed to, he was an abolitionist who was very much opposed to slavery, as was Charles Darwin as well. But these were uncommon opinions to hold in these days. So he is a political figure, but indigenous knowledge, what you do find is, of course, he writes it in a very attractive manner. But so I'm not sure if it's all as true as we he gives the impression. But for instance, there's a great story where he's with the Ature indigenous people, and they take him to the last speaker, or he's with, I'm messing up the names, but there's an indigenous group where he stays, and they take him to a parrot, which is the last speaker of the language, the Ature. So the Ature people were, destroyed in a tribal warfare, but there was one speaker that remains, and this was this parrot. And he writes down phonetically what this parrot is saying, and it's about like 40, 50 words in this language, which he managed to somehow translate a little bit through the help of a related language. And then there's a person who writes a poem about this, this is the last remaining speaker of a... So, I mean, he is in contact with the indigenous, and they do want to show him things. Or he goes electric eel hunting, which is very cruel. So he's in Venezuela and Calabazo, where they have these large mud pools where these electric eels live. And what they did was, to catch these, was to drive in horses. So Mustangs from basically the prairie, or wild horses, they would gather them up, corral them, drive them into one of these mudded pools. Of course, the electric eels would discharge. The horses would die, or at least be very, very scared, and they would be on the banks with spears trying to hold them in this pond until the electric eels did their damage and were sort of empty. Then they took them on land, and then Alexander von Humboldt immediately starts to examine them and tries to shock himself with it. And the whole scene is weird to read because it's very cruel to animals. Well, it's a lot of animal cruelty, even though there's little account to be taken about it. He doesn't write a lot about the cruelty side of it. He's very interested in these electric eels. He's been studying animal electricity for such a long time, experimenting with himself as well, giving himself shocks. So he's very interested in this animal. But you get this sense of somebody who's, well, people know he's an important figure, and they show him what's interesting in the vicinity, flora, fauna wise. So in that sense, he's very much in contact with. Sorry.
Let's do one question and then wrap up. There in the back.
As I understand it, Humboldt did not a really big discovery or invention. And is this probably because he has a too classical kind of thinking? Because you told when he thought he should find the essence of plants, and then thought perhaps there is a prototype of plant, and then I think about leaves. That is the prototype, more or less. But that's a really classical kind of thinking, and that's probably not the kind of thinking to make inventions as Darwin did, or Newton did.
So, I mean, he himself sort of gave an explanation as to why he was never did a big discovery, even though he did many discoveries. He says he'd just taken too much on his plate. He just chewed off too much. He should have become a specialist at something instead of, he's very much a generalist. So he studies a lot of fields, and this is also to his own detriment, right? He like, not like Charles Darwin, he's known for like this big theory. But nonetheless, I wouldn't say that it's classical thinking. So what Goethe is writing about the metamorphosis of plants is very close to what we later on get in evolution, that plants come from simple forms and have diverged, right, in this great tree of life by this process of natural selection, variation. And Goethe is already thinking of plants changing, not every species being stable, but going from one species to another, right? Morphing. So he puts so much emphasis on the morphology of plants and how through metamorphosis you can get different plant parts, that Darwin is super enamored with Goethe's work. He's very much fond of this idea that the leaf is the basic unit of plant life, that maybe other different plants have come from this leaf form. And we also notice to be true a little bit. If you look at a flower, and you look at the different parts of a flower, so, of course you get the leaves, and you get the more colorful leaves, then you get the stamens, the pistil. If you look at these anatomically, these are modified leaves, all of them. We get green leaves, but floral petals are also leaves, only different color, right? And stamens and pistils, if you look at them anatomically, they're actually curled up leaves somewhat. So this was a very good idea. He just didn't have all the notions yet that were needed. There was no deep time or real geological thinking about long stretches of time. There was no variation in selection yet. Humboldt did not see nature as a struggle for existence, not as a survival of the fittest, but more as a harmonious whole. So there's all these things that are missing, but it's very revolutionary what he's doing, I would say. So not necessarily classical. Yeah.
All right, we leave it. Thank you very much again. Thank you again for this lecture.
Thank you.